Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm Mila Atmos, and I'm a global citizen in New York who's deeply curious about how to build a brighter future. On this show, we take big ideas about civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. It's 2024, and the future of America is in your hands. Democracy is not a spectator sport, so we're here to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to make impact. After all, tomorrow starts today. We've heard this before, and we'll say it again. Democracy is on the ballot this year, not only in terms of who to elect for president, but also with ballot measures that offer opportunities for direct participation in public policy decisions. In recent years, citizens have passed policies such as minimum wage increases, decriminalization of marijuana, Medicaid expansion, restoring voting rights, and yes, reproductive freedom. Our guest today is Melody Fields Figueredo. She's the executive director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, or BISC, which works to strengthen our democracy using ballot initiatives. Chris joined us on the show in the last election cycle, and we're thrilled to have her back. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat again.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you back and talk about the ballot initiatives in front of voters in this cycle. But before we get into the weeds, let's lay the foundation first for this conversation. What are ballot measures and how can they be used?
Well, I think the way you said it at the beginning is like we really have this opportunity as people to take power and agency, and that is what ballot measures are. It's us, citizens, putting issues that are important to our communities, gathering signatures from our neighbors, and putting incredibly important issues that are fundamentally going to change the material conditions of people's lives on the ballot directly to make that policy change. And it has just been such an effective tool to not only make that policy change, but also really change the power conditions in states across the country that may not get featured in a presidential election, right? It may not be a battleground state like a Utah or Nebraska or Missouri, but really gives the front and center choice to voters to make really important decisions for their lives.
Yeah, it's really good to center this, that the ballot measures really give voters the opportunity to vote on issues directly instead of through the party or the candidate. And in fact, some issues like raising the minimum wage transcend party lines. I think that continues to be true, right? Especially when we're talking about abortion rights. And this year, again, abortion rights are on the ballot in 10 states, perhaps most notably in Florida. And the initiatives in these states are, of course, not all the same. It's like they're on a spectrum, with maybe New York being the most expansive. How do you make sense of these, and which ones do you think are most important that you're watching really closely?
Yeah, I mean, although every state is different, right? Like I grew up in Texas, I live in Washington, D.C. Those two places are very different. And although they may vary a little bit different on policy, what is true for all of them is people understand that government should not interfere in personal medical decisions in people's lives, that those choices are left up to individuals and their doctors, and that is true for everyone. And then we have some opportunities like in New York that is more expansive, that is more of an equal rights amendment style, right? That is not only thinking about pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes, but also important civil rights issues, especially for LGBTQ plus people. Or Colorado, that is not only affirmatively putting in the state constitution a right to an abortion, but also eliminating the ban on state funding for abortions, which is really important for low-income workers or people who are on Medicaid. And then, the vast majority of the rest of the 10 issues really ultimately try to tackle whether a state constitution guarantees the right to an abortion. But then there's this one advisory question in Illinois that could potentially impact the future of whether there is health insurance funding for things not just about abortion, but also things that are incredibly important like IVF. So that's kind of how they vary in different states. And ultimately, every state is different, like a Florida, right? Which is incredibly important if you think about the global South. There is no other state right now, because of the abortion bans, that can provide and take in the 84 patients a year that need to access reproductive care in that state. But they also have to pass by 60% of voters. That requires a wide spectrum. Democrats, Republicans, Independents to come together and vote yes on that. So it's going to be different for each state. But I think one other important thing that sort of connects them through, like you mentioned before, is people are voting, especially on reproductive freedom, regardless of party affiliation. It is really a resonant issue for everyone. And that is so important as we head to the November election.
Mm-hmm. You just shared just how wide the spectrum is in terms of what's possible in each state. And I'm wondering, in the last few years, there have been several referenda on the right to have an abortion, on reproductive freedom. And the last time you were on the show, we talked about the Kansas referendum. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how the more recent initiatives have evolved. Or maybe they haven't. Are they the same? Are they different? And I'm thinking here about Montana, and you mentioned Florida, so I'm thinking about what happened in Ohio. How do you put these pieces together as you think about this year?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think really you see the immediate impact in 2022 from the Dobbs decision, right? From the Supreme Court's decision overturning Roe versus Wade, right? And then in that election, immediately, we had ballot measures that affirmatively protected the right to an abortion. And then you had states like a Montana, like a Kentucky, that voted down abortion bans. And then we go to Ohio that not only was moving towards putting reproductive rights on the ballot, but at the same time, you saw the state legislatures kind of see that momentum of 2022 and looked towards 2023 and said, oh, I don't want that to happen in my state. And before we even got to the general election in 2023, put forward from the state legislature a ballot measure that would have limited and prevented and undermined the will of the people to make these types of changes. Luckily, voters, and this was in a special election of August, right, of a non-major election year, and they failed in that attempt because people understand that this is such an important right for them to put issues on the ballot and give themselves the power and agency to make progress when they don't see progress in their state legislature on wildly popular issues like minimum wage, like medical marijuana, like reproductive freedom. And now you fast forward and all that momentum has just been gathering, and we come to 2024 where we know this election is about reproductive freedom. And we see 10 states that have said, we want to take the power and agency. We are not seeing the progress that we need in our communities by our representatives in government. And we want to affirmatively make sure that we say yes to reproductive freedom. That is so fundamentally important. But at the same time, I think what is also escalated, and this is really playing out in 2024, is power. And I define power by the GOP, by conservatives, by people in elected office, whether it's Secretary of States, whether it's attorney generals, are not liking that us, the people, are taking this power and are just creating these immense obstacles to undermine the power of us, the people. That's what democracy is made out. So we've seen things like in Florida, where they've approved a fiscal note that has really inflammatory language about what the potential fiscal impact could be about having abortions in the states, that is really misleading to voters. We're seeing in states like Utah, where their state legislature just moved forward with a state legislatively referred measure that would allow the state legislatures, if approved, overturn anything that voters approved. We're seeing this play out in Ohio with the redistricting measure, where they have, again, put really inflammatory and misleading language to confuse voters. So I think these are sort of the conditions that have changed in 2024 when we last talked. Actually, it is because us, the people, we're taking power into our own hands. We are making change. And then those in governing power aren't liking that change that we're making because it doesn't fit their image and what they're trying to do in government. And so this escalated shift in 2024 is especially because we've been able to successfully defend reproductive freedom at the ballot.
Yeah, so while reproductive freedom ballot measures are getting a lot of attention, and that's what basically the mainstream media talks about all the time, there are actually more initiatives affecting democracy and, of course, exactly these anti-democratic measures that you just mentioned. But there are also civil rights, ballot measures, election reform like ranked choice voting or instituting open primaries. But since you just talked about the attacks on being able to put ballot measures on the docket, how can we protect that process to use ballot initiatives by citizens?
I mean, it's so confusing, right? Ballot measures about ballot measures. That's super hard for people to understand. And there's a number of ways where people can help. You know, number one, in states like Arizona, North Dakota, and Utah, which I had already mentioned, they will have on the ballot issues that will reduce their power, undermine the will of the people, make it harder for you and me to put issues on the ballot. You know, in North Dakota, it would require a ballot initiative to pass in a primary and general election. In Arizona, they would raise the signature gathering requirements. Do you think 1 million's a big number? A campaign could gather 1 million signatures but still fail to make it to the ballot if they miss the requirements of gathering a specific number, a percentage of signatures in every single district in the state.
Can you talk about that a little bit more in detail? Because I think that's still confusing. So what you're saying is that not only do you have to have 1 million signatures, but also you must gather signatures from every single district in the affected state.
Oh, I mean, I can tell you the details.
Tell us a little bit more about the details.
It's even more confusing, right? So it would require...
Yeah, it's confusing, but this way, we know.
10% of votes cast for a governor in an election in the 30 legislative districts in Arizona. They would have to gather those signatures and 15% for constitutional amendments. So basically, it's requiring people to do math, like really just like calculating really hard numbers. And, you know, if you're in a rural area, that might be a hard threshold to meet, right? So whether you're in a Pima or a Tucson or, you know, a Phoenix, you know, those are our large cities, but of varying sizes, that could actually, if you don't get the required percentage in whatever those legislative districts are, you may not make it to the ballot. And, you know, what we already saw this year with the reproductive freedom ballot measure in Arizona, over 800,000 signatures were gathered. That is 1 in 5 Arizonans. That is a significant number. But if they didn't make this technical requirement, they could have possibly not made it to the ballot. So that's why things like this web of technicalities that are actually going to make things way more expensive, you know, it's going to make it even harder for everyday citizens, for community groups to put issues they care about on the ballot. And this is sort of like how things are evolving in real time. You know, football, right? You have to get to the goalpost to get that touchdown in the end zone, right? They're moving that goalpost every single year, every time we're successful. And this underlying theme of this election is really our democracy, and whether, you know, we're going to fall further into authoritarianism because, you know, we are fighting back as people on making changes on really important issues like reproductive freedom.
Well, You mentioned the successes and also how it's become more difficult this year than it was last year, and it was more difficult again yet than the year before. Ballot initiatives, though, by and large, have been successful, specifically when we talk about reproductive freedom. How do you think have those successes changed our democracy?
I've been in democracy and civil rights work for more than 20 years, and I've been a political organizer for a good chunk of my career. And for a long time, you couldn't get candidates to talk about reproductive rights, let alone say the word abortion. Because of the success that we've had 7 wins already under our belt in blue states and purple states and red states. It's just fundamentally changed our democracy. It's also really exciting people and making them more likely to vote and get engaged in our democracy because they're excited about this issue. They're excited about the opportunity to say yes for reproductive freedom. One of the exciting things about 2024 is many of the states, I already mentioned Arizona, have broken records in their states with signature gathering, right? In Missouri, for their reproductive freedom ballot measure, they gathered 20,000 signatures in one day, the most ever in the state. In states like Colorado and Montana, they were able to get them more signatures than they've ever been able to in the history of their states. So to me, this is a sign of progress. This is a sign of a very engaged and excited electorate who want to participate in our democracy. And they are doing it by going into their communities, gathering these signatures, putting these issues on the ballot. And then, come election day, they're turning out and voting for this issue because they're so excited.
Right. So how have the outcomes of ballot initiatives changed the way that you work? And also, I'm curious, how does BISC work with people who want to put ballot initiatives onto the ballot? Like, how does it work? How do you do the work? And are you a partner? Are you working as a consultant? Or do you also gather signatures? It's just like a technical question. I'm curious.
Yeah. So you can think of us as sort of a bridge, right? We work with local organizations, state leaders, and help them turn in their dreams into reality. So we provide research. We provide technical assistance. We coach a lot of the campaign managers. We do trainings for folks. We're just about to kick off a training around mis and disinformation. So going back to football season, right? We're that utility player, really. We're the special teams that really allow the defensive and offensive line to both score that touchdown, right, and win on the election day, or be that help with that defense to stop bad ballot measures or bad bills that are trying to undermine the will of the people from moving forward.
So clearly, to be supportive of a ballot measure and to be against a ballot measure are different things. What are your different strategies for those two things?
Mm-hmm. One thing that is really universal across, whether it's a yes campaign or no campaign, is really the importance of voter education, especially voter guides from trusted resources. When people have voter guides that really break down what these issues mean, what a vote yes or a vote no means, that really, really has a huge impact of whether they skip that question or at all. Because what we know from the research that we've done is actually people don't want to make mistakes. They see the potential impact on these issues in their community, and they want to be well informed to be able to say, yes, I know when I vote yes, I'm affirmatively protecting the right to an abortion, which is going to be really important in a state like Nebraska this year, which not only has the Protect Our Rights ballot measure, which will affirmatively protect abortion, but they also have a ban on the ballot too. So that is going to be so critical in a state like in Nebraska to make sure we are making it really clear to voters what a vote yes and a vote no means. Also, it is really about connecting the dots for voters of what these issues mean. For example, we can see that in many places that reproductive freedom is popular, it's likely to win and have crossover voters. We actually have to explain to those crossover voters that while you may vote yes for abortion rights, you also actually have to vote for a candidate that's going to go in the state legislature or go into Congress and also protect those rights as well, and really show them how the opposition is very connected to Project 2025. Like, we have to make those connections for voters because they're not going to make that leap on their own. So, I mean, whether it's yes or no, the voter education is just so critically important. And then, what the nuances and the differences are ultimately going to be about the messaging, right? What you're going to need to say for a no campaign or yes campaign, it's going to be a little bit different. And those tend to be some of the bigger differences. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to making sure that people understand what their vote means and how it's going to impact their community.
Mm-hmm. We'll continue our conversation with Chris after a message from our sponsor, Shopify. And when we come back, we're going to talk about economic justice initiatives, the uncommitted movement, and this episode's Civic Spark, a small action that can help ignite big change. But first, when you think about businesses that are selling through the roof like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, you definitely think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret, Shop Pay, that boosts conversions up to 50%. That means way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going. So, if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level, no matter how big you want to grow. And that's what I love about Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Skims uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/hopeful to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/hopeful. I also want to share about a podcast that will scratch that itch for all you history buffs out there. It's called This Day in Esoteric Political History.
Do you know about these stories? In 1933, Huey Long invented a holiday to prevent a bank from collapsing. In 1960, years before he was assassinated, someone tried to kill JFK with a car bomb. And in 2014, remember this? There was a whole news cycle about President Obama's tan suit. On the podcast This Day in Esoteric Political History, we talk about the forgotten stories that may teach us a lot about the very strange moment we're living in right now. Check it out. This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Chris Melody Fields Figueredo. In the intro, I mentioned that citizens have voted to raise the minimum wage, and this year there are several economic justice initiatives on the ballot, which covers a range of issues, including, again, raising the minimum wage in some states, also guaranteeing Uber and Lyft drivers the right to unionize and paid sick leave, just among many others. So tell us more about these measures and how they fit into this election cycle and the way that the Harris-Walz campaign talks about the opportunity economy.
We are in the final stretch, right? We're after Labor Day, and the labor movement has been so critical to any type of progress that we've made throughout history. Because the economy, because the inflation is top of mind, economic security is so top of mind for voters, that means that's also coming to the ballot as well. Things like paid leave, states like Alaska, Nebraska, and Missouri, they're going to have paid sick on the ballot in addition to raising the minimum wage, at least in Alaska and in Missouri. You mentioned the opportunity, and this is a really exciting opportunity in Massachusetts for what are often known as gig workers, Uber and Lyft drivers, the ability to unionize. A couple years ago, they were trying to do a replication of Prop 22, which was a ballot measure that passed a couple of years ago in California that actually took away protections from workers. And it was very misleading to workers. They tried to do that in Massachusetts. It failed to make it to the ballot. And now unions have gone proactive, and they've put a question 3 that will allow those workers to be able to unionize. States like California are continuing to raise wages for workers, going to $18 per hour. Wages and benefits is top of mind for the American people. They've been wildly popular basically since 2016 when we put these issues on the ballot. They've been successful. And again, sort of like what I mentioned before, states have been able to build this momentum over the last several years to continue to deliver for, families and communities to make sure that they have the money in their bank accounts to provide for their families.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is not a question about a ballot initiative, but one thing that I'm also wondering about is the uncommitted vote during the primary. In my mind, it was like using your vote in a direct democracy way to protest what was happening and what is continuing to happen as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
So how has the relative success of this movement informed your thinking and approach to ballot measures?
That's such a great question. And I think, as I've grown in my own time and working in democracy and elections issues, often we have a very limited view of what democracy means. And so I think for most people, right, their understanding democracy is I vote on, the second a Tuesday in November, and then that's it, right? And I think early this year, there was so much talk about voter apathy, and we just weren't seeing that play out in real time. And I think uncommitted was a very clear example of people actually are very engaged. They just want the conditions to look different, and for the people who are supposed to be our representatives in government, to be our representatives in democracy, to listen to us. And I think that plays out very much for ballot measures too. What we've seen over the last several years is really a block. And a lot of state legislatures, not just in Republican states, obviously in Republican trifecta states, we've seen people turn to the ballot measure process even more, but even in some blue states like Massachusetts, right? Like they are taking this issue around unionization for Uber and Lyft workers to the ballot. So I think that's what we all have to really reflect on in this election. And it's certainly true for us, is like voters are actually telling us very much. The people are telling us what they want. They want democracy and they want government to look different, and they actually want it to be of, for, and by the people. And I know in Future Hindsight, you think about the future, and it really makes me think of this Octavia Butler quote of talking about predicting the future of tomorrow is the child of our today. And if we are not listening, if we are not trying to reimagine and look forward, we're actually not responding to the conditions and the needs of the people so we can build that more equitable and just world that all of us deserved. And I think that's so true for the uncommitted movement as well.
That's very well put. It actually makes me wonder whether it's not time to have like a totally new way to think about parties and candidates and, like restart. I don't know. Restarting is, of course, very difficult. It's impossible in some sense, of course. But I kind of feel like thinking about ballot measures and the uncommitted movement as a way for the people to say, this is what we really care about. And yet the candidates and the parties continue to be unresponsive and in many cases are contrarian to what the people put on the ballot. How do you think about that? I mean, I know it's a kind of a big philosophical question, but I just wonder, do you think about it?
You're speaking my love language here. But, so one of the things that I say and sort of the charge that I've made to our partners who are thinking about ballot measures is to make them love letters to our people. And it really is about that forward thinking, that forward movement, that reimagination, that dreaming, sort of that world building that is really fundamentally important to get us to, like I said earlier, is that world that all of us deserve. And, government is working actually the way it was designed. And that is really to maintain the status quo. And I think through ballot measures, through things like the uncommitted movement, through, the work of organizations like the Working Families Party, right? That is actually what this moment is asking of us, is to fundamentally think differently about the way we do politics. I know there's been a lot of talk that this is a vibes election, and it's sort of said in a very sarcastic way. But to me, vibes are about belonging, right? Joy and hope. That's something I want to be a part of. And I think that's why you've seen this big shift, is like people want to be a part of something that is much more motivating, much more optimistic, much more responsive to the possibility of tomorrow versus let's just keep things the way they are. And to me, that's not democracy. Democracy is always a constant experiment and about changing the conditions, because we as people will continuously evolve.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that people are saying this is a vibes election, because at the end of the day, though, vibes are not going to win this election, but votes will. And so are the vibes going to make people turn out at the ballot box?
I think that's the question, right? I mean, I know the conversations that I'm having in states like Florida, where my parents live now. The vibes are important, but it feels different, right?
Yes.
And so now the job of the next, the last 2 months is to turn those vibes into turnout, right? Is say, yes, you want this, you're excited. Number one, make sure you register to vote. Right?
Yes.
Make sure you check your status, because states like Ohio are purging voters. So don't make an assumption, right, that you are registered to vote. Check your status, register to vote, request that absentee ballot, vote during the early vote period, make a plan to vote, and get your neighbors out into the community, out all across. Vibes are important because we want to belong and want to listen to the pressure of our community. So we have to also not just think about our individual vote, but how are we going out into our community and making sure our grandmas, our aunties, our tias, our tios, right? Our friends, they're going out to vote in too. That is what's fundamentally important in this final push.
Yeah, well, I was about to ask you, what is your most urgent message for voters in this moment? Because in Pennsylvania, early voting starts on September 16th, which is just around the corner. The election truly is upon us. So thank you for sharing everything about getting registered, being registered, double-checking your registration. It is also about to be National Voter Registration Day, which is September 17th. And that is a good enough time away that you can make sure you can register. So please do that if you aren't registered yet in the audience. And make sure you vote. You have a plan to vote, like you said. So last time we spoke, you mentioned the unifying power of ballot measures, and that ballot measures are unifying voters and reducing polarization. And I think that's still true, but in some sense, I feel like there's a battle over ballot measures, and maybe it's no longer as unifying as we once thought. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think it's true that for everyday Americans, for you and me, right, it is a unifying. That is what gives me hope, right? We are seeing on a number of issues that are seen as more progressive, things like reproductive freedom, like legalization of marijuana, like raising the minimum wage or paid leave. They are passing regardless of party affiliation. I think politicians have made this a partisan issue when we even see from our own research in the states where they have tried to undermine the will of the people to make the process harder. I mean, in a state like Ohio, Republicans voted to stop that bad ballot measure in 2023 in August, right? In Florida, because they have to pass by 60% of the vote, that is going to require, again, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. So it really is the politicians right now that are making this a partisan issue when in the reality, I think of the majority of us, this is really about issues that are going to have a very big impact of whether we have food on the table, of whether we can make healthcare decisions, of whether my district of where I vote is going to be rigged and I'm actually not going to be represented in government. That actually is a no-brainer to most people. It isn't a partisan issue. So when you go and vote on a ballot measures, there's no D or R next to that measure. It is the politicians who can't win fairly, who are changing the rules in government to undermine our voice. And so I do think they are still a unifying force. And now it's our duty, regardless of party affiliation, to turn out, yes, on these issues, but actually go the next day beyond the election to our state legislatures, to our city councils, to make sure these issues that we just voted on are implemented, that our representatives in government are listening to us, because we've essentially sent them a mandate at the election. And so, it is unfortunate that the partisanship has happened from the very people who are supposed to represent us in government. And to me, that's not democracy. The people who voted you into office, those are your constituents, those are your employers, and you're not listening to them. And, that just means, again, to like what you were saying, is why this question about the future of our democracy is so fundamentally important in this election, yes, but also what is the future of our democracy going to look like?
We're always looking to be the best kind of citizen we can be. And we always ask our guest for a recommendation for a civic spark, a small action that can help ignite big change. And I want to preface here by saying that we've already talked about voting, and so I'm going to assume that our audience is registered and prepared to vote. So in addition to voting, what's one clear, simple step we can each take to be more empowered and really be strategic players in civic life?
I mean, voting is the starting line, it's not the finish line. And it is fundamentally critical for people the day after the election to make sure, number one, that ballots are being counted, but two, that as we start these state legislative sessions, lame duck is going to come in a snap right after the election. You better look at what bills are being pre-filed, because that is going to give you an indication of what your state legislature is going to do. So voting is the starting line. Next step is making sure that we go into the state legislative sessions and hold power accountable and make sure that our elected officials are actually listening to us and following through on the promises that they've made.
Well said. So just to be clear, when you say we're holding power accountable, you mean you reach out to that elected official?
Yes, you go to hearings, you call your whatever representative in government is. So many organizations will have day of actions, especially at the start of the legislative session. Get involved, because truly voting is just the starting line.
Thank you. So as we are rounding out our conversation here today, looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
So I am now the mother of a junior in high school, 2 years away from college. But young people, wow, they give me so much hope. And they just truly have this sort of clarity of the future they want to be truly inclusive of all of us. And I see it every day through my daughter's eyes of, the things that her and her friends talk about. And again, to like tomorrow is today's child. They're not the future, they're the present, they're the now. And young people truly inspire me through their engagement in things like the uncommitted movement and in the college campus protests throughout last spring. Young people are the people that we need to be investing in, because they're not the future, they're our present. They are the now.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much for joining us on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Chris Melody Fields Figueredo is the executive director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, or BISC, in Washington, D.C. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider. They're co-hosts of their very own education podcast, Have You Heard? And their new book is The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual.
The founders wanted education freedom, right? That their real goal was to have parents educating their children and training them to be religious. And it's pretty shocking to go back and realize just how much training they thought people needed in order to participate in democracy. They often had quite an aggressive vision about what kind of skills kids needed to learn. And then you sort of track across decade upon decade, and you watch that vision get narrower and narrower. And that understanding of training kids to participate in democracy kind of falls away. And in many ways, that has set the stage for the vulnerability that we now see.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. And before I go, first of all, thanks so much for listening. If you like this episode, you'll love what we have in store. Be sure to hit that follow button on Apple Podcasts or the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app so you'll catch all of our upcoming episodes. Thank you. Oh, and please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It seems like a small thing, but it can make a huge difference for an independent show like ours. It's the main way other people can find out about the show. We really appreciate your help. Thank you. This episode was produced by Zach Travis and me. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly and act boldly.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.